is a part of Brooklyn that's meant to absorb people coming out of Manhattan. This is a place where if you lose housing for these individuals, then you have a real problem of where you're going to put them. There was a vision that perhaps people moving out of Stuyvesant Town didn't deserve those apartments, maybe made more money than rent regulations would allow them to pay for the rent-stabilized prices, and they could find another place. But Starrett City was very different. You're talking about 60 to 90% of the people receiving housing subsidies there. What was going to happen to the mayor's grand plan for housing if that place went market rate? Could have been a tragedy, and it could have been a big problem for him. So I think that determined his global view of the city, his administration's global view of the city, I think predetermined a lot of what the responses were to dealing with those two housing situations. And at that, I think I'll let go to my more informed colleagues here.
Okay. Amanda.
I mean, my take on that is the city responded differently to each because they had a different stake in each. I mean, with Starrett City, it was a federally subsidized project. It was in the Mitchell-Lama program versus Stuytown, where, I mean, the city would argue now that maybe they do have a stake in it because Fannie and Freddie hold senior debt on the building. But I mean, in that case, you know, they stepped back and said, let's let the private markets take over for whatever political reasons, whatever relationships they had with the Spires. And the coverage on each from the media perspective, and, you know, we're a weekly business paper, but then at the same time, we do have a daily website where we're kind of on deadline. We have to post the news before our 4 p.m. Alert goes out. So in terms of our coverage of both of those topics, you know, we did try to put the facts out as fast as we can, kind of speaking to what Charles said about who gets the news out first. You know, should we cover something if we see it on some of our competitors? You know, should we cover it if we see it on the blogs? In our sense, you know, we try to get out the news first on the web and then do the analytical side of the story in print. And I don't know if, I'm guessing probably my colleague on The Real Deal is probably the same way where, you know, when they're doing a story in print, you know, they probably have more room to do the analysis of all the issues, whereas on the web you're doing more of the news aspect of things. And in terms of these two projects, I mean, I think they're just, Starrett City and Stuytown, they're representative of what's going on in general with residential real estate and some of the projects that we're covering. I mean, it's not just these two buildings, but there are tons of over-leveraged properties that are now getting a lot of press because of these two major projects that came out. And a lot of our coverage now is kind of sifting through, you know, who are the developers who are underwater, what's going to happen to all these buildings in the city. And I'm going to pass it on to.
In looking back, is there something that you wish you had written back then? Or a concern that you had in the back of your mind that you didn't raise in the story? Or that someone else, or maybe another story that was out there was dead wrong and you thought really threw everything off?
Well, I would have liked to probably have done more coverage on the Starrett City project itself. I mean, just from looking at all the other coverage, it seems like it wasn't as, I guess, sexy of a story because it wasn't in Manhattan. You know, you weren't talking about people in Manhattan and so forth. And there were a lot of issues in the Starrett City kind of restructuring that I would have liked to touch upon, which I didn't really get an opportunity to do that.
Okay. David.
Good morning. I wanted to just touch on a few kind of historical facts, just to put a little bit of this in context. I grew up in Flushing, Queens, back in the 70s and 80s, and this entire era of this real estate downturn is not what I would consider a new event in a sense. It is played out before on a much smaller scale. Anybody who was around in New York back during the late 80s, early 90s, when there was a big wave of co-op conversion in the boroughs, and there were conversions of apartments in Manhattan as well, may remember that, you know, this type of risk and over leverage and get the resulting downturn happened after the '87 stock market crash, and there were reforms that were enacted by the Attorney General in the early '90s following that downturn because we saw the same kinds of risks being taken that we see in a lot of deals right now. We saw co-ops being acquired by people who really had no business buying real estate. We saw apartments being sold for way above what their appraised value should have been. We saw people selling apartments to foreigners who never showed up at their apartments, never paid their common charges, never really did the types of things on a macro level that, on a micro level that really would make those properties sustainable. And so, we fast forward to what's going on now, and I find it kind of, interesting that you talk to some of the best and brightest people in the business right now who repeat the same kind of, groupthink. We never saw this coming. And I just literally go back to when I first started writing for The Real Deal. I covered, a number of real estate stories when I worked at Cranes for the web, even going back to my days at Bloomberg in the 90s. There were people who were trying to get attention, trying to kind of shake the trees and trying to get the world on notice that, a lot of these deals that were being conceived in 05, 06, 07 were fraught with danger. There were people that knew it. I mean, there were people that will maybe not admit it, but they knew that there were problems with a lot of these deals. There was a lot of securitized debt that was literally taken from U.S. investment banks and sold overseas because the investment bankers knew that these deals had underlying problems. And if you, some of the stories that we covered, prior to the crash, during the era of Stuytown and Starrett City, when there were attempts to convert a lot of these buildings to market rate, when Larry Gluck acquired the Riverton in Harlem, the battle at Independence Plaza, which was another property where there were these similar types of issues trying to convert affordable housing and stabilized tenants to market rate apartments. It was the same kind of frenzy that went on, and what happened during that those I would say 3 to 4 years during the middle part of the decade was that we started to see a lot of assumptions made where developers would work with appraisers and work with lenders and put together these pro forma numbers. We saw it in commercial real estate as well. We're going to be able to get someone to pay $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a month for rent in an apartment. And why? Because the market is willing to pay that. Why is the market willing to pay it? Because there's nobody else that's offering less rent. So you kind of get into this cycle where we saw buildings, and then it started to spread to luxury rental apartments in the city, the Apthorpe, Manhattan House, the Sheffield, where developers would come in, overpay for a lot of these properties, charge astronomical rents, kick out market rate tenants, literally do everything they could in some cases to try to get the rent stabilized tenants to just give up and leave. And in a few cases, some of these rent stabilized tenants started to fight back, and they held out, and everybody thought they were crazy, and everybody thought that they were just being alarmist, and they wanted a free handout. And what ended up happening is we started at places like The Real Deal, where we had, nobody from the established government agencies would ever call us back because they didn't know who we were. So I would call the AG's office, I would call, the buildings department, and they would be like, who's The Real Deal? Same. I would call when I worked at Cranes, or if I wrote for the Times, and I would get a return call in 5 seconds. But we kind of talked to a lot of these folks. We started looking at a lot of documents that a lot of people really weren't looking at the time. We started to see reports from Fitch and from S&P where it was a remarkable treasure trove of data on a number of these projects. Securitized debt at Sheffield, securitized debt at One Madison Park, for example, that I just wrote about last week. Issue reports where we would not only see, how much was paid for these properties, but what these folks were telling investors about what they could do to these buildings. I remember when I first read some of the reports about the Riverton. Larry Gluck bought that building, I think it was what, 07?
The first time in 05.
05? Right. He bought it in 05, and he was basically telling investors that he could convert about a building that was about 90+% rent stabilized to about 50% market rate. Well, how do you go about doing that? You pretty much do everything you can to get those tenants just exhausted and want to leave the building where they, in a lot of cases, had lived 10, 15, 20 years. And he was going to try to raise the rent to a level where very few people in Harlem could afford to pay those rents, and the people that could afford to pay those rents didn't want to live in Harlem in a lot of cases. So what did you end up having? You ended up having a situation where this was happening literally all over the city. Developers were buying up properties, overpaying, overestimating their ability to gain rents, and then overestimating their ability, in the case of condo conversions, to sell these units. And then you had a situation where, well, what do you do now? Did the mainstream media start to catch on? Because we were writing stories about some of these properties when nobody else was even thinking about them. We've been writing about the Sheffield. We wrote about the Apthorpe. We wrote about Manhattan House. We've written about a number of these projects that were kind of under the radar for years, where eventually it started to catch on to the mainstream press, catch on to the Journal, catch on to the Times, and then we started seeing more of the mainstream press challenging the conventional wisdom about where the market was going. And now what we're seeing is kind of the results of a lot of these situations where you're starting to see non-judicial foreclosures where the lenders who knew what was going on back in 07 and 08, they really did not want to foreclose on a lot of these properties because they faced potential litigation from their investors and their shareholders. They also didn't want to foreclose on a lot of these properties because, frankly, foreclosure in New York is a nightmare. It takes years, in some cases, to go through. Rector Square, for example, in Battery Park City is going through a foreclosure. It's been going on since January, and Yair Levy has been fighting it tooth and nail. And what's probably going to end up happening is Related has been managing the property. This is a former Related property, and this was a part of a securitized deal where potentially Related could end up taking over the property. They did a lot of that type of thing in the 90s where they took over distressed assets. And we're starting to see now a second wave of distressed properties just emerge where we're going back into the documents and we're starting to see the problems underlying these buildings where developers were going around collecting, getting mezz loans from hard money lenders in Hackensack, New Jersey, and in Brooklyn and places where they couldn't, because they couldn't get money from anybody else. They're borrowing money from friends. They're literally out there trying desperately to hold on to these buildings because they have no ability to maintain the common charges and the carrying costs of these properties. And I think what you're going to start seeing very soon is the fallout from a lot of these deals that were conceived back during the middle part of the decade and went under the radar from a lot of mainstream press. And you'll start to see some of the results of these things very soon. So I'll just pass it on from there.
Okay, Elliot, you're the last one up. Lean in towards the microphone. And I hope you'll talk a little bit about your sources and how you dealt with them in the course of covering these two deals.
Well, I guess I should start by saying I wasn't even here for Stuytown and had... I gave a disclaimer before, Jim.
That's a piss poor.
I arrived in New York right after the sale, and this was right before Starrett City. And when I first got here, the first thing the editor said is, go find out about this and watch this project in Brooklyn. It'll probably be the next Stuytown, which is really kind of what New York, at least the press and elected officials were prepared for. And so when it went for $1.3 billion, of course, it was the story of a developer that was actually blocked from buying it and losing their money in the meantime. And at least from my take on it at the time, and I wasn't very kind of deeply sourced, I was more just kind of feeding off the viral press coverage. It was kind of a tale of how the mainstream press, when these stories do go viral, does just kind of follow the lead of elected officials. The press may start the conversation, but the only thing that does give it momentum is electeds, and especially empowered electeds. And so with Starrett, I mean, almost immediately when I arrived, there were Sunday press conferences by Anthony Weiner. Sunday, of course, is the best this kind of Chuck Schumer and Anthony Weiner trick to always get in the papers without many questions asked. And this was right after the sale. At first, Anthony Weiner was calling for committee meetings and criticizing the deal, and then all these advocacy groups were incredibly well prepared and showing you all the places where the deal could be blocked. And then I was on the phone with one of the lobbyists for the owners of Starrett, and there had been an advisory that Schumer was going to call for the sale to get blocked. And they said, no, you must be misreading it. It's not blocked. He'll just criticize. Like, no, it says blocked. And so they were, caught off guard for this. I guess the momentum that the electeds would kind of give the issue of trying to stop the sale. And so, the buyers and the sellers, I think, tried to kind of fight back a little, but what were they going to do? They tried to show, no, we aren't these awful landlords as they'd been vilified, and got like the Tenants Association to write a letter for a different property they owned, saying how great the landlords were. But in the end, after this media storm, which really did kind of cast the developers in a bad light, fairly or not, the buyers in a bad light, the Bush administration ended up blocking it at HUD. And Chuck Schumer definitely played a big role in that. Compare that to Stuytown. It was obviously a private transaction, and I think the electeds who complained a lot at the time as well just simply weren't empowered. But out in Starrett, I think both the press coverage and the electeds kind of fed off each other because the press knew that the electeds actually were empowered, and there was kind of this hope to save Starrett. Now, was that too pro-tenant? Was it fair to the buyer who really just kind of fell into this? Who knows? I mean, if the question was, why are you paying $1.3 billion, would that actually work? Apparently not, if you look back now. But I think they would certainly say they were treated unfairly.
Okay. It seems like a couple of the panelists have attacked the mainstream press, which I hope that includes Tom as well as myself, so I'm not alone.
That was my response time. Thank you.
For ignoring some of the trends and the stories about places like Stuyvesant Town, or simply tailing after the politicians and being a stonecutter, what I call a stonecutter. You just merely take down what they say with your hammer and chisel. So what stories did the mainstream press miss, if that's the case? Starting with Stuyvesant Town and Starrett City, because there was an awful lot of coverage. So what was it that they got specifically that they got wrong?
Well, I don't know necessarily if they got it wrong. They just didn't get it. I think that you got to remember back during the middle part of the decade, a lot of the reason why a lot of these deals happened was that there was a frenzy, in my view, of institutional owners basically realizing that they can maximize the value of a lot of these assets. I mean, a lot of these buildings were owned by institutional investors that, were watching a potential to make huge amounts of money by putting these properties up for sale. And they came up with these valuations on these properties based on, pro forma numbers that were just like, because essentially you make a presentation to a potential buyer and, you tell them, well, you can, this is developable to, 500,000 square feet, and you can make $40 a square foot on rents in this property. It's got a great potential as a condominium, and it sounds like pie in the sky, but to a potential buyer, it sounds fantastic if you can actually make those numbers kind of pencil out. And I think that what was happening back at the time of a lot of these deals was the press, and I also kind of bring in people like CNBC, for example, where they were kind of like cheerleading a lot of these deals, and taking the numbers and saying, okay, this is a fantastic deal. The economy's going great. We can make a ton of money. How are you going to make it happen? And, converting a lot of people did make a lot of money and made some and did some very good deals and had very high quality properties and got wealthy on the during the boom. But the actual kind of work of converting a lot of these properties from rental to condo or from rent stabilized to market rate, it's not easy. And I've seen buildings, I've covered buildings in great detail where the tenants fought like hell to fight the developers in every way possible to stop these conversions from happening. We've looked at it at Manhattan House. We've, Sheffield, they fought for years in court, and that was one of the reasons why a lot of these deals kind of went bad, was because they spent so much time just fighting with the tenants to make these deals happen in the first place, that by the time it got around to actually, starting the conversion, they only had, money to maybe convert like a third of the building or half the building, because the bank's not going to give them money to convert an entire, 500, 600, 700 apartment building, and just have, converted apartments with new kitchens and bathrooms, and there's no way you can fill it in a reasonable amount of time. So now you have a lot of buildings around New York City that are half sold, a quarter sold. People can't get financing, and don't blame this just on the downturn. This was starting to happen already, where developers were going overseas to find buyers in '07 because they knew that they couldn't get enough New Yorkers or even Americans to get a down payment, get financing, and be able to close on a lot of these buildings. And there are buildings all over this town right now that are, have great apartments, they have great lobbies, great health club, and 2/3 of the apartments are empty. And they have very little prospect of filling those units anytime soon. And that's kind of where we are right now.
On behalf of the mainstream media, please, and I'm flattered to think that the New York Post would be considered mainstream on any level. I would like to say that Elliot's stinging rebuke of my side of the media is to some degree accurate. And it's also to some degree something that's been going on for a long time. There have been colleagues of mine who are stonecutters, or some more sophisticated, who use cuneiform and bricks of soft clay, which takes a little longer to set. And there have been more ambitious people. It's like the cop on the beat as opposed to the cop who wants to go into, explosives or training or hostage negotiation. There are fewer opportunities for the more adventurous or enterprising reporter these days in mainstream media. And that's a sad thing because despite all the fine work done by my colleagues in the blogs and the real estate press, it doesn't have the impact if you don't have 2 million people reading it every day, and presented in a form that makes people care, where you're not writing about like pro forma numbers and valuations, you're writing about what's happening. Joe Blow's going to be out on the street. 5,000 people looking for a place to live. Greed on the other end of it. All the sorts of things we do to sensationalize stories, but really, in effect, make them interesting, make them engaging to readers, making it a political problem for government in a way that you don't get if it's really pretty much read by people inside the business. Not enough of that is happening anymore. My last adventure in that realm was a real estate story to some degree. About 4 or 5 years ago when I wrote about the city's homeless services program, where they were basically putting people on the street, working people, retired people, living in rent-stabilized units in the boroughs, Brooklyn and Bronx mostly, by a segment of the industry that didn't hire lawyers to investigate your income, but hired goons to take the apartment door off of the place you lived in for 30 or 40 or 50 years. So when you came home, you had no running water, you had no door, and so because of city policy was giving them $3,000 a month for a crappy apartment where they were now charging $500 to house homeless people, destabilizing entire neighborhoods. So we wrote that story. We found out who the people were behind this, the undisclosed, the secret cabal of property owners who have been doing this apparently for 30 years. And one level or another. We put their faces in the paper. We wrote about how much they were making. We wrote about how much the city was spending. We wrote about the people who were living in roach-infested apartments the city was paying $3,000 a month for. We wrote about the people, the 80-year-old woman who didn't have hot water of any kind in her apartment. They had to go to a fire hydrant to get it in a bucket. These are the kinds of stories that move people. Within a year, the city revoked its policies on this. For the first time in 25 years, after 25 years